I'd like to welcome Jaime Nack, who is the founder of Three Squares Inc., which was founded in 2008, and this is to balance the social, environmental, and economic portions. Really, she's the director of sustainable and greening operations for the 2008 Democratic National Convention in Denver. So she was in charge of the sustainable planning for the event as well as the city of Denver. So that's for thousands of people, for really 90 hotels, and to minimize the ecological footprint of the event more. And since she's been working with the Climate Reality Project with Al Gore, and in addition to that, she's also the founder of Women in Green Forum, and she launched the One Drop Interactive for a tech platform for sustainability, and she also served at the White House Council. So it's quite a bit there. So she's done a lot of work with advising on sustainability, and is often at the table with large corporations as well as prominent policymakers as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jaime Nack onto the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nina, for sharing that with us as well. So when someone asks you to give a 17-minute talk about the future of the planet, you have to pause and think about how are you going to use that time? Do you want to focus on, in my case, my career is focused on environmental, so do I want to talk about clean vehicles or green building or net zero or carbon offset projects? I mean, there are a range of topics, but when I sat and really thought about it, to me, those all seem like very external solutions and projects that we work on, but they don't necessarily get you in the heart, right? And I realized that one of the beauties of FutureTalks is that we have a diverse audience and a diverse set of minds and backgrounds and experience in the room. And I wanted to talk about and spend my time here with you today about more the internal and what moves us from the inside so that we can affect change on the outside. And so when I was thinking about what moves me inside, deep within my core, I thought back and remembered to a time recently, a couple months ago, when I was invited to a lecture with the famous orchestra conductor, Gustavo Dudamel. He's now leading the Los Angeles Philharmonic, which is where I'm from, and he was giving a talk on silent communications. So I know very little about orchestra conducting, and I've never studied communications, but I thought this could be fascinating. I'm curious what this genius conductor would say. One of the things about Dudamel is that he grew up in very humble beginnings in Venezuela. He was surrounded by music. So both his mother and his father, he was the son of a trombonist, and his mother was a voice teacher. But he also was a participant in Venezuela's musical education program called El Sistema, which is Music for Social Change. This program has 400 music centers throughout Venezuela to teach the youth, and mainly these are youth that don't have riches or resources to attend fancy music classes. And so they teach the youth the power of music, and they've trained 700,000 young musicians in Venezuela. Dudamel knew that not only was it in his home with his mother and his father, but he was attending this program, and he was really excelling quickly. So he just thought he had a natural gift for music that brought him to the world stage that he's on today. Yet there was something that always puzzled him. He knew that his gift and his calling for music was more magical than just the training that he received in class or the music surrounding him at home. And it wasn't until he sat with one of his maestros who started talking to him about the Spanish poet Garcia Lorca. And Garcia Lorca described the power of the duende. Now, we're here in Norway. Norway, I've heard, is the land of the trolls, these magical little creatures. So I thought it was very fitting to channel Garcia Lorca and the duende in my talk with you today. So the duende, Garcia Lorca, defines as the spirit or the magic within. The duende is an elf-like creature, so kind of like a troll, an elf-like creature from Latin American folklore that rests on your shoulder and guides you, either in a good way or a bad way, right? In this case, the maestro described to Gustavo Dudamel that the duende is an earth spirit who helps the artist see the limitations of intelligence. Lorca writes, "The duende, then, is a power, not a work. It is a struggle, not a thought. The duende is not in the throat. The duende climbs up inside of you from the soles of your feet. This is the mysterious power that everyone feels, but no philosopher can explain." And this took hold of Dudamel. And for him, he realized that the power of the duende was really helping him enter his state of flow every time he was conducting on stage. And he realized that his duende, his little elf sitting on his shoulder, embodied all of the wisdom from his indigenous ancestors from Venezuela. And he started to study them and study them and study them. And he realized that those lessons not only can help guide him forward, but they're actually innate in part of his spirit, and that's what made him so successful and created his magic as a conductor. So he shared with us the lessons from his duende. The first lesson he shared was that listening is more important than speaking. The indigenous elders always listened to the needs of the community before they spoke to the community. And for Dudamel, he understood this direction as he needed to listen to every single one of the members of his orchestra before he decided to change things up. He needed to hear them and feel them. The second lesson from his duende was that community is stronger than the individual. Now, this is a very powerful lesson for one of the most famous orchestra conductors in the world. As you can imagine, ego kind of goes along with that title. But the indigenous way of life is to value contributions from all members of the community equally and not put any one leader on a pedestal, which is exactly what an orchestra conductor does, right? But Dudamel was used to receiving praise and awards and recognition in his name, and he was used to being labeled as one of the most famous and best and most skilled conductors in the world. But he realized, and this was a huge lesson for him, that the best conductor in the world is nothing, is no one without his orchestra, or without her orchestra. So these lessons stayed with me, and I started to think about my duende. Do I have a little elf-like creature on my shoulder that I've never honored or recognized before? And so I started to think about why I'm fueled from the inside out to be so passionate about working in the environmental arena. And I realized that, similar to Dudamel, my duende was also linked to my family and my family history, and the wise words, in this case, of my grandmother. My grandmother grew up during the Great Depression, and she lost her mother early on. So the first lesson that she instilled in us is waste not, value everything, every moment, and every second, and every resource. She told us many stories about having to raise and feed her 5 brothers with 1 potato. Now, she may have exaggerated a little bit. She was also very good at storytelling. But conserving resources was something that was very important for her because it was a survival situation. This mentality of scarcity, combined with her deep desire to conserve resources so that she can not only provide for her family and her community, was something that she passed on to us, her children and her grandchildren. I remember going to her home and seeing her cabinets full of glass jars for food. She looked like she could feed a whole army if they came over. And I realized that she was saving every single leftover, and she knew that it could be used for tomorrow or the next day or the next day. And she saved them also in glass jars, not plastic. She never used plastic. She wasn't from a disposable generation like we are. There was no throwaway option for food, for clothes, for furniture. There was always a way to use what you had and make it last longer. And that lesson stayed with me. I now realize that there's no coincidence that my career has focused on resource conservation. So in my past 10 years, I've designed waste minimization plans for convention centers in Johannesburg, for concerts at the base of the Eiffel Tower, for automotive factories in Guadalajara. I mean, this is something I do day in and day out, and I never connected it back to my grandmother and how she lived her life. The second lesson is pay it forward. Because her earlier years were strenuous, My grandmother always wanted to make sure that we understood the value of service and doing for others. This was passed on to my mother, who taught me to give unconditionally and even anonymously was the greatest gift. And then I realized that's also tied very closely with sustainability itself. The word sustainability focuses on meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Professionally, I saw how few women were involved in clean tech and clean vehicles and clean transportation in the early days. This was about 10, 15 years ago. And so I decided we needed to create a space, a venue, to not only highlight the women that were leading in the space, but to encourage young women to join the field. And we created the Women in Green Forum, now in its 9th year, to build the pipeline of future leaders. Every year we grow, every year we mentor and train another 50 students that then go on to find internships, jobs, mentors, etc. I also decided to have a policy that anytime I write a recommendation for another person, I do so as long as they pledge to write a recommendation for someone younger than them. And you'll be surprised how many times that person looks at me and says, "But I'm not a supervisor, I can't write a recommendation." And just instilling in them the power that their support of someone else can make a difference allows them to see themselves as a leader as well, and it pays it forward many times over. The third lesson passed on to me by my duende was to always use your voice to speak up for those who cannot. My grandmother Sally was an assertive woman. She would not let anyone pick on the underdog or the underrepresented. I watched her defend and support others who felt that they did not have a voice. And I never realized how powerful it was for me as a young girl to be surrounded by assertive women. They say I grew up and exceeded their dreams beyond their belief. And this carries over to my work, in that I often feel, as defending the earth, we're both speaking up for natural resources and the future generations who want to be able to enjoy the same clean air, clean water, and forests. In closing, what Gustavo Dudamel taught me with his story of the duende is that the journey of life is really about recognizing the other in ourselves and ourselves in the other. Similar to what Prince EA said across the street, I think not only can we recognize ourselves in some of our past, in some of our duende, but we can recognize ourselves in everyone here in the room, and vice versa. And I think that is the power of FutureTalks, breaking the silos and bringing us together in one space. We also must pay respect to the fact that all of those from our past and all of those that we meet along the way have a tremendous influence on us. I hope that you leave the session today inspired to learn from one another, to explore your own duendes. They're sitting there. You might not have met them yet, but they're there. And to be guided by these mystical creatures representing lessons from your past. We all play a role in guiding future generations. They will not only inherit a planet in distress, but they hold the ability to push for policies, technologies, and embrace new lifestyle choices that will bring us a brighter future. Let's teach them about the magic that they hold within. And you may not realize it yet, but each one of us sitting here may become duendes in the future. So listen to them, pay it forward, and speak up for those whose voice has been silenced. Thank you.